So in this lecture, I wanted to do a quick spotlight about some of the different types of arthropod pests that you might encounter on the farm and the best ways to go about trying to identify the differences between these types of organisms. So when I say the word arthropod, what I'm talking about is a very diverse group of animals, all of them being invertebrates, and they all belong to a phylum called Arthropoda. So, phyla are simply a large group of related organisms in a hierarchical system of classification that was actually developed many years ago by a guy by the name of Carolus Linnaeus. And you're going to see examples of this system of classification throughout this semester when we talk about our botanical crop families. So the phylum Arthropoda is actually by far one of the largest phyla in the animal kingdom. It contains, for example, organisms that are insects, as well as crustaceans, arachnids, among others. And it encompasses actually over 1 million classified species, with perhaps as nearly 9 million suspected species that have yet to be organized and classified. Arthropods are a very unique group of organisms because they are pretty much adapted to live in every kind of environment on the planet. They're found in deserts, mountains, rainforests, and even in hot springs. So they're found in all of these crazy extreme environments. They are, though, unified by the fact that they all contain a hard outer skeleton called an exoskeleton, and they all have jointed body parts or limbs. Many arthropods, as you can see in this slide here, have evolved these little antennae for some extra sensory input. And the bodies of arthropods are also unique in that they're all segmented. So this doesn't really mean like repeated segments like in an earthworm. Earthworms actually belong to a different phyla. But the bodies are broken up into these segments or distinct parts, generally a head, an area called the thorax, which kind of houses all of like the like legs and wings and things that allow the organism to move, and then the abdomen, rather than having like repeated segments like the worms. And so this unique body morphology is what sets the arthropods apart from other types of animals. So in the taxonomic classification of organisms, arthropods are subdivided into smaller, more closely related groups, sometimes called subphyla or classes. Okay, so there are 5 classes of arthropods that are actually quite common as pests as well as beneficials on the farm. So I'd like you to be able to identify examples of each and to know just very generally how these different classes differ from each other. So we're going to see some examples in the next 2 slides, starting with the class Malacostraca. So these include the sow bugs and the pill bugs. If you've done any gardening in San Diego, no doubt you've seen both of these. They're usually feeders on vegetables and plant material, but they're actually seldom pests. They don't cause a whole lot of damage unless there are like thousands of them that you're working with. And we do end up having them a lot in our garden beds, especially during the wetter times of year, because these organisms, they breathe through gills, and those gills have to stay wet. So they have to remain in more wet habitats usually in the winter months for us. So as a result, we end up finding them around, mulch, under rocks or logs, or if you have a lot of debris on the ground, they usually kind of hang out protected in those wetter environments. They have usually many pairs of legs, up to 7 pairs of legs, and their head is kind of like a shield shaped. The main difference in anatomy between a pill bug and the sow bug shown here is that the pill bug is usually recognized as a little tiny animal that will roll itself into a tight ball if you poke at it, if you disturb it. Sow bugs, though, stay flat and their legs kind of stick out. Okay. The next class is Chelopoda. Kilo means 1,000, poda means legs. So these have many, many legs. usually a pair of legs attached to each of the body segments. And this includes all of our centipedes. Okay, centipedes, this guy shown here is a class of predator organisms. They like to eat a lot of other smaller arthropods. They also have very long antennae compared to other arthropods, and they move very quickly. And that's in comparison to the millipedes, which belong to the class of Diplopoda. The diplopods they're rounder. Each of the segments has 2 pairs of legs. So when you see di, that means 2. Poda is legs again. And compared to the centipedes, these guys are the herbivores. They're not gonna be feeding on other arthropods. They're gonna be hanging out, eating decaying leaves and other dead plant matter. So they include also detritivores. They feed on the detritus, which is the kind of dead, decaying organic matter. Some of them do eat fungi or suck like plant fluids, but for the most part, they usually are pretty harmless. They can, though, be a nuisance pest, like in and around your house. They can like hide in your crawl space or hang out under landscape mulch. Okay. Like the sow bugs and the pill bugs, our centipedes and our millipedes are also usually found in wetter environments, like under leaf litter and mulch, because they don't do a good job of conserving the water in their body. They have a tendency to dry out, so they need a wetter, moister environment to survive. And that's actually in contrast to the 4th class, Arachnida. This is a group of spider-like arthropods that have, they've been able to adapt to a much wider array of habitats, including very dry desert-like environments. The arachnids include, obviously, our spiders. They also include mites, ticks, scorpions, and the harvestmen shown here. And compared to our other classes on the top of the slide, the arachnids have only 4 pairs of legs. So they have 8 legs total. They also lack antennae. And their body parts, rather than having multiple segments, they usually have just 2 main body segments. They have a large abdomen and then a smaller head, which is usually combined or fused to the thorax. So they're only made up of 2 major segments rather than many, many segments like our millipedes and centipedes. The arachnids, they represent the second largest, and next to the insects, which we'll talk about on the next slide, the second most agriculturally injurious class of arthropods. They have very diverse life histories. They can play different roles in the food web. For example, the mites, they include not only beneficial predators, but can also include organisms that are parasites on insects and parasites on mammals, or can be extremely dangerous pests to our crop plants. Spiders, on the other hand, these are mostly beneficial predators and maybe predators that consume many types of arthropods. So these are good guys to have around. The last class that I'd like you to be familiar with is the largest and probably the most important class of arthropods, which is the insects. They belong to class Insecta. The insects, they range in size from very, very tiny, almost too small to be seen with the naked eye, to quite large organisms. They include many very notable members like all of our ants, beetles, aphids, bees, butterflies, dragonflies, and wasps, among many others. And contrary to popular belief, most insects are actually beneficial. 99% shown in this pie chart are beneficial, are not pests at all. They are beneficial to our environment, to our economy, even to human health and welfare. They are crucial parts of ecosystems and food webs and can be very important players in the farm ecosystem. They are not, most of them are not pests, which a lot of people automatically go to. However, of this small percent that can be pests, these guys are some of the most damaging pests of crops, both during crop production and post-harvest during the storage stages. And so it's very important to learn how to, be able to identify an insect and know how insects differ from these other classes that we've just seen. So some of the defining features of our insects is that they have 3 usually distinct body regions. They have the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. The head is where all of the feeding and sensory perception is housed. The eyes, they usually these really big compound eyes. The thorax, as I mentioned earlier, is primarily responsible for the insect's locomotion. All their legs and their wings, if they have them, are coming out of that segment. Some insects have one pair of wings. This guy has two pairs. Some insects don't have wings at all, which we'll talk about in a second. And then the abdomen is the back end of the insect, and it's responsible for reproduction and excretion. When we look at their legs, they have 6 legs, so 3 pairs of segmented legs attached to the thorax. And then again, they usually have 1 or 2 pairs of wings, but some insects are interesting and they don't have wings at all, or they might fluctuate between having stages where they have wings and stages where they don't have wings. It's really helpful sometimes to see side-by-side comparison of insects and the arachnids, specifically mites, because insects and mites are often easily confused. So I always like to kind of show kind of the side-by-side. So if you are looking at trying to identify really tiny insects and you might think they're a mite, here are some really easy ways to tell the difference. Mites, first of all, differ from insects in that they only have 2 main body parts. They have the head and this big abdomen. Insects have 3 distinct body parts: the head, thorax, and abdomen. In the mite, the thorax is fused to the head, so you don't even really see it. If you count the legs, a mite is going to have 8 legs, like a spider. An insect is going to have 6 legs. Insects may have wings, like in this plant bug here, or this beetle. Mites never have wings, so that's another way to tell the difference. And then if you end up, grabbing a microscope or maybe a hand lens, if you want to take a look at the head and look at what the mouth parts look like, mites always have tiny little sucking mouth parts. So they suck sap from our plants, and their damage usually appears as this like browning tissue or mottling kind of speckled pattern. Insects, on the other hand, have a range of different types of mouth parts depending on the species. They can have these mandibles that allow them to chew away at plant tissues. They can have sucking mouth parts like the mite, or rasping mouth parts, which is a mouth part that allows them to scrape away at cells and then suck the tissues, the phloem from the tissues. They can have sponging mouth parts, kind of like a bee or a fly, or siphoning mouth parts. Think like the proboscis of a butterfly or a moth. So lots of different types of mouth parts, and as a result, the damage or the feeding that they do, the symptoms that they incur on plants varies a lot, depending on the type of mouth part that they have. Another unique feature about insects is that insects grow by shedding their exoskeletons. The exoskeletons can't really stretch like our skin does as we grow up. So instead they have to molt. So they shed their skin, and that reveals a new skin underneath, a new exoskeleton that will rapidly harden into the next larger exoskeleton. So most insects, they go through several such of these molting stages before finally molting into the mature adult form. So when we locate an insect and we want to try to identify it on the farm, what we're actually seeing is a snapshot of this life cycle. Okay, so one tactic in seeking a solution against a specific insect pest is to look for weaknesses within this chain of its life cycle. Okay, so insects can have two basic types of life cycles, or metamorphoses, where they progress from an egg to an adult. They may either go through a complete metamorphosis, where their body morphology changes very dramatically, or they can go through what's called incomplete metamorphosis, where they have these like immature nymph stages that look very similar to the adults, and they're just molting each time and getting a little bit bigger. Okay. But, regardless of whether they go through complete or incomplete metamorphosis, which I'll show you some examples on the next 2 slides, all of these insects start off as eggs, and eggs are a very weak link for insect pests because they are a stationary stage. They lack any defense systems. And so eggs offer a really easy target for many predators, parasitoids, parasites, as well as folks looking to integrate some kind of pest management strategy on the farm. So here's a look at that incomplete metamorphosis. It's also called gradual metamorphosis. So the insect progresses very gradually from an egg to a nymph, and then the nymph is the immature stage, like in a grasshopper or true bugs or this earwig here. And the nymphs often look very similar to the adult stage. Usually they're just like missing wings and the sex organs. Um, Sometimes, like in this grasshopper and this earwig here, they are different colors slightly, so they might stand out more to predators. And because nymphs can't fly and they might not have structural defenses, sometimes they are preferred targets for pest management programs as well. So you can see in the two figures on the left here, the nymphs will usually go through many molting stages until they finally reach that adult form that can reproduce and can fly around, be more mobile. So during incomplete metamorphosis, the insects go from egg to nymphs, which molt a couple times until they reach adult stage. And then those are like the three main stages of their life cycle: the egg, the nymphs, and then the adult. Okay. And that's in contrast to insects that undergo complete metamorphosis, where there are 4 distinct life stages. They start as eggs, which hatch to larvae. The larvae turn into a pupa, and then the pupa eventually give rise to the adult. Okay. So we have some examples shown here, like that's the example with a butterfly. These are lady beetles, and this is some other kind of beetle. It looks kind of like a weevil almost, but it always starts with egg, goes to larva, a pupal stage, and then that goes to an adult. So like the nymphs, the immatures here, the larvae, they might go through some stages where they do molt, but in contrast to a nymph, these guys look nothing like the adult stage. So caterpillars look nothing like the butterfly here. If you're ever wondering what the larval stage of a lady beetle looks like, it looks like these little alligator guys right here. They look nothing like the adult stage. Okay. Larvae are usually good targets for pest management because they might not be as mobile as their adult stage. They might not have wings, like the caterpillars don't have wings to fly away. And the skin is usually softer. So things like parasitoid wasps can act as really good biocontrol agents here. They're really good food sources for our predators. For insects that go through this complete metamorphosis, the larvae have to make this radical transformation from larva to adult. And to do that, that requires them shedding their skin. And it's usually accompanied by the process of creating some kind of protected resting stage. You think like a cocoon or this pupa right here with the in the lady beetle life cycle. So this resting stage, this pupal stage, is mostly defenseless from attack by predators and parasitoids. And so pupal mortality can be really significant. This could also be a good stage to target for pest management. The pupal stage also, because it lends itself to a resting stage, many insects will choose the pupal stage as kind of a convenient way to spend long cold winters or hot dry summers where food sources might not be as available. And so sometimes this resting stage is termed a physiological diapause. So the diapause can often be just like a convenient, can also be a convenient weak link for controlling insect pests. These are because they're kind of just hanging out, hunkering down to last a stage where they don't have many resources to survive. So from the pupa emerges the insect in its adult stage. And this life stage is often the least desirable with respect to targeted pest management because, again, the adults usually have wings, they can move around, they have typically more structural defenses on their body, which makes adult insects more difficult to manage. The exception here is that because the adults are reproductive and they are actively looking for mates generally during that time, you can use things like pheromone traps as a way to target the adult stage. But compared to like the larva or the eggs and the pupal stages, the adults are a lot more challenging to manage. So we usually target these earlier stages in the life cycle when we try to manage them. So besides identifying pest life cycles and looking for those weak links in the life cycle, we can also look at the type of damage, and observing the types of damage can also help you to find out what is causing that damage and then how to best control it. So we're going to learn to identify different types of damage, which is going to be helpful to managing insects, because many times also you might not even see the organism itself. You will only see the symptom, the damage that they have left behind. So I think it's helpful to kind of learn to recognize these different damage types so that you can then narrow down what pests you're dealing with. And a lot of the times the type of damage that you see does correlate with the type of mouth parts that that organism has. So we're going to take a look at different types of mouth parts and how we can correlate that to damage. So the first one we're looking at are piercing sucking insects. Examples include our white flies, spider mites, and these little organisms called thrips, these insect thrips. And when organisms have piercing sucking mouth parts, especially in the case of these three examples, they usually give the appearance of browning of the foliage. And then the foliage also appears mottled. So it has this really distinct speckled pattern that you'll see on the leaves. And the way that we can check for these organisms, if we see these mottling symptoms, we can turn the leaves over and look for those insects hanging out on the undersides of the leaves. That's usually where they like to hang out. So in small numbers, these organisms actually can be pretty tricky to spot, and it might be helpful to have like a hand lens or to, practice identifying these out in the field so you have a really good eye for them. And depending on the population of this organism, often high quantities can be tolerated and damage is really not that bad if you're okay with just the leaves looking like that. Other types of organisms, insects that cause piercing, sucking damage are going to be our scale insects, like this one here, as well as our aphids. These are other two common examples that cause this type of damage. And a lot of the times, if the numbers are low, these insects will not really cause a whole lot of damage to your plants, but in high numbers, these insects can actually attract other organisms like ants, because they end up secreting sugary fluid called honeydew from their body, from their abdomen, which ants just love. It's a sugary sap that comes out of the back end of the aphids and the scale. So when you're looking for these types of organisms, it's often really helpful to find the ants first, usually see the ants first, and then turn over the leaves and you see a bunch of aphids or scale along the stem. The other thing that you will generally notice if you have very high numbers of aphids or scale is that sooty mold will start to grow on your leaves, shown here on the right. So sooty mold is the type of fungi that grows off of the honeydew that's left by the aphids and the scales. So the insects secrete the honeydew over the leaves, the mold spores will land on the sticky honeydew, and then they just begin to reproduce, leaving a black soot all over your plants and your fruit. So this can make your fruit pretty much unmarketable. Doesn't look that great. But while the damage done by the aphids and the scales might not be that remarkable, down the road, if you have a really bad, infestation of sooty mold, that can cause some economic injury, which would warrant control of the aphid and the scale, not necessarily the mold itself. Okay, so look for those kind of indicators, check out the plant, and if you see a bunch of ants trying to herd around aphids or farm the scale, that's a first good flag that you might have some pest issues. And then the mold growth is usually a good indicator that those piercing sucking insects are around your crops. Some other types of damage that we generally see, especially in the springtime now, are insects with chewing mouth parts, like all of our caterpillars, cabbage loopers, cabbage worms, tomato hornworm is a really big worm season pest that we have to deal with. And all of these guys are capable of eating big holes from the leaves of your plants. So the holes, they usually, or they can be created in between the veins of the leaf, where the caterpillar will skeletonize, make these holes throughout, or they can even eat from like the tip of the leaf and just mow down the entire leaf, which is very common to see from these larger tomato hornworms. If you're growing leafy greens, this is obviously going to affect your overall yield because the insects are physically removing the harvestable part of the plant. Removing foliage, though, from vegetables that you're harvesting the fruit from, like a tomato plant. So if you have this tomato hornworm and that insect is just eating all of the foliage, that's obviously also going to cause declines in your overall yield because the insect is removing the photosynthetic material that is needed to create the sugars to boost the fruit production. So there's an indirect type of damage that's occurring from that. Okay. So caterpillars usually leave these really big holes. If you see little tiny shot holes throughout your leaves, usually that indicates smaller beetles, like our flea beetles and asparagus beetle. So that could be a good symptom to look for, these little tiny holes. You may also see like larger chunks of a leaf cut off, and that, if it's not caterpillars, that could also be snails and slugs, or sow bugs sometimes, or even birds are sometimes the culprit. Okay, so holes in leaves are sometimes a challenging symptom to go by, but generally these little tiny holes are going to be your little beetles. So we know caterpillars can eat big holes through leaves, skeletonize leaves, mow down foliage. Some caterpillars, though, are interesting in that they feed also on the stems of plants. And that is very common for this guy here, the cutworm, to do. Cutworm is the name used for a pretty diverse group of caterpillars that are the larval stage of adult moths. So there's a couple species of adult moths that will have these larvae that hang out near the soil. So the moths actually lay their eggs in the soil. The eggs hatch in the fall, and they produce larvae that are actually capable of just overwintering, hanging out in the soil. And then they end up doing the most damage kind of in the early spring when they emerge from this state of hibernation. Okay, so they hide in the soil during the heat of the day. They come out at night in the dark to feed, and they usually just cut down like the first stems they encounter. They're pretty promiscuous in their choices. They just sort of eat a bunch of different plant species. So it's very important, especially with like your younger seedlings, your transplants that you put in the garden, to scout for cutworms. And if you're scouting in the daylight, you usually have to kind of dig around the plants, the base of the plant, around the soil, and hand pick them to remove them. And you can also place little collars around your plants if you know that you have a history of cutworm issues in your garden. I wanted to also kind of briefly mention that not all insects feed by, chewing parts of the leaves or feed by sucking. Some insects have kind of weird specialized ways of feeding on their host plants, like leaf miner insects. These are very distinct insect species that create these pretty weird little squiggly lines on leaves. Leaf miners are generally flies, and the flies lay their eggs inside of the leaf. And then the squiggles are caused by the larva of the fly feeding its way through the leaf tissue. So they spend that vulnerable life stage protected within like the mesophyll layers of the leaf, which is just pretty wild. So that's one interesting example of another way that insects may present their damage to your crops. Another one is that some insects will actually create these little outgrowths on plants called galls. And the gall shown here is actually created by an insect pest called Phylloxera, really bad pest of grapevines. The grape Phylloxera is an insect of it's a pest of commercial grapevines like worldwide. And farmers have had to rely on resistant varieties and grafting methods to find cultivars that are going to be resistant to this grape Phylloxera. So galls are super fascinating and plant scientists are still trying to understand how this whole thing happens. But basically what we do know is that the development and the growth of the gall is completely under control by this insect. It induces this change in the plant tissue. And so they create these little houses, these galls that can act as habitat and food source for the insect. So the inside of the gall contains all this nutritious starch tissue that the insect can feed off of. And then the gall itself also acts as a little sink, like it concentrates all the resources in that small area from the surrounding plant parts. And it also provides the insect with this like physical protection so it can reproduce and thrive without getting eaten by predators or getting attacked by parasitoids. It's a really wild little insect that you may come across in your scouting. So to conclude, basically, besides learning to recognize these different types of damage symptoms and correctly trying to identify insects to know how to manage them, one of the big challenges to identifying insects and other arthropods is that many of these organisms look just like the beneficial organisms on the farm. So the good and the bad guys tend to look alike. So I thought I would end on just 2 examples of some insect pests that you'll probably encounter at some point in California that are very easily confused with beneficial organisms. So these 3 examples, these are all insects called Hemiptera. They're part of a group called the true bugs. The guy on the left here, the geocorids, these are called big-eyed bugs. They are actually beneficial insects. Even though they're teeny tiny little guys, they actually will eat the eggs of tomato hornworm, that big crazy green caterpillar I showed you a couple of slides back. This is a natural enemy, a predator of those tomato hornworms. So if we see these little guys around, we want to keep them around, especially in the worm season. They are a great little predator, and they will eat small caterpillars, the eggs, even flea beetles and mites. Okay, so they're cute, but they're a voracious predator. It's kind of awesome. These guys here, the chinch bugs, they like to hang out on our mustard plants. They also hang out on weeds, and you need to watch out for them because they are a minor pest on the farm, especially if you grow grapes. And then this guy here, the lygus bug, which looks very similar to the chinch bug and the beneficial insect, the big-eyed bug. These are a pretty bad pest of strawberries in California. So we need to watch out for those. And then lastly, I wanted to show you another textbook example of when the good guys look like the bad guys. So this guy here on the right is a very common pest all over California. It's a type of mealybug. This one here on the right is a mealybug, and then this guy here on the left is the predator of the mealybug. It's called the mealybug destroyer. And so it's funny how they end up looking very similar. They're both kind of white and fuzzy. This is the adult form of the mealybug destroyer. It's just actually a beetle, and this is the larval, the pupal stage. Okay, so when the bad insect looks very similar to the predator of that insect. So take home message here, it's just to take your time with identifying insects and other arthropods. Make sure you're identifying things correctly. Make sure to consult all of your pest management texts and online resources, and don't hesitate to reach out to local experts and entomologists to confirm any kind of ID before taking those next steps to manage the insect pests on the farm.